we welcome TSN Hockey Insider and our bud, Darren Dreger, on a Friday.
Yeah.
Darren, were you down in, were you in Florida?
I was.
Hobnobbing and kibitzing and all that down there? That's cool.
Yeah.
That's quite a gig.
It was an excellent gig, but it had a twist to it. So my lovely wife decided this would be one of the trips, few, that she accompanies me on. We flew out to West Palm on Sunday afternoon. So we get there, I don't know, probably around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, by 6 p.m., she is in the wrapper, sick as a dog.
No.
Yeah. Like fever, chills, the whole nine, and really never surfaced, never left the hotel room till Wednesday. And then you can probably hear it a little bit. Tuesday, I wake up and I'm like, I'm not feeling great. This is a little rough. So anyway, I mean, that aside, now it's a good location.
Yeah.
There was no breaking news, but this was one of the rare March meetings where, okay, no rule tweaks and changes. We can live with that. I mean, just leave the game alone. That's the camp that I'm in. Just leave it alone. Have conversation, which is what they did. But this was more about making sure that the world knows that some of the things that they've incorporated, video review, things like that, specific to goalie interference, they're working. And they went through that exhaustive exercise with their general managers to prove to everyone, maybe the general managers included, that the hockey operations people actually know what they're doing inside, the situation room and whatnot. So there were some small takeaways that made the meetings there, I think, valuable.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, so it's just like there really wasn't anything big. We talked about cut resistant stuff. As you said, it was tutorials on this isn't goalie interference, reminders to the powers that be of how these things are judged. And then a day after everyone leaves, then we get the expansion bombshell from Emily Kaplan. You're like, everyone was just there, Gary. Come on. And he doesn't like the stuff public. No, we're not looking at it. Well, yeah, you are. Yeah. You're behind the scenes schmoozing with everyone, and you have been forever.
Well, yeah, and I'm not defending, but in fairness to that process, I don't remember a meeting other than this one where the assembled media didn't ask him about potential of expansion. Right. Every single meeting we ask about that. And I remember being in that scrum in December at the Board of Governors meeting, which is the owners meeting, where it's probably more appropriate to talk about that. And he just didn't have much of an update with anything. He just said, no timeline. The one thing I would qualify, and I'm not trying to throw dust on the reporting here, because the Friedkin Group has been around for a while. And as Emily Kaplan identifies in her ESPN piece, they have made several gestures and have had a number of different conversations and meetings with the commissioner's office to talk about the idea of expansion into Houston. So I think that would have been his response if we'd have asked him at some point this week. What he's never willing to do is provide a timeline. Yeah. In the last couple of years, he hasn't said, no, we're not going to expand anymore. He does admit that there are lots of people. There's tremendous wealth around the world, around North America, and parties who want to be in the NHL family. In this case, it's interesting to me because we also know that Houston is a market that the NHL thinks would fly for a number of different reasons. The obvious rivalry with the Dallas Stars, a major market from a media perspective, a TV standpoint. And probably most importantly, doesn't it just all talk about dollars? At the end of the day, that's what we're talking about here. And the expansion franchise fee has got to be north of $2 billion with a B. So you're talking about big numbers that make other owners around the National Hockey League go, okay, yeah, the talent pool in hockey is getting more shallow and more shallow. You can understand that. It gets more. The other part to it, I know I'm rambling a little bit here, but when you're adding more teams, and Bettman did talk about this, he's always loath to change what the playoff structure looks like, be it the number of teams in the playoffs or the matrix. Doesn't want to tinker with it. So now you're going to go to 34 teams and still have 16 teams making the playoffs. I mean, when you continue to expand, and it sure looks like the NHL is going to expand, then you absolutely finally have to be open to significant change in other areas. And I've never been able to see why it's a bad thing to have more teams in the playoffs as opposed to the 16 that have been there forever and ever and ever.
Okay, so I'll counter that just with a thought. Is there a professional sports playoff as good as the NHL's first round?
Not as we talk today, there isn't. You look at some of the matchups.
Not broke, don't fix it thing, right?
No, you're right, Ryan. But the flip side to that is that people bitch and complain about it every single year. You get Edmonton, LA. Who's Colorado?
Well, Dallas, Colorado.
Yeah.
I was just looking because Dallas, if it's a 1v8, however you want to look at it, Dallas would be the second seed, and that would get you Minnesota or whoever, St. Louis at the bottom, but you get Colorado in round one.
I'm glad I get to see it though, right? That's the other side. You might not have get to see it otherwise.
And that's
sucks. It's round one in a way, but that's why round one's so good. You get these titans playing each other sometimes.
And it's why I don't vehemently argue this, because the trump card for me is if you're going to hoist that trophy, the Stanley Cup, we got to beat everybody in the process. Right. So if Dallas is the true top Stanley Cup contender, and it sure looks like they are, I think a lot of us thought that. I mean, there are other teams, and Colorado's in that conversation too. But as difficult as it is, and of course we know that a Stanley Cup contender in that series is going to be ousted in round one. Okay, then you weren't a top contender. Sorry, it looked like you were, but to hoist the Stanley Cup, you've got to beat everybody in 4 rounds. So I think with more numbers of teams, again, through expansion, I don't think it would be just a significant issue for the National Hockey League and the schedule makers to go, okay, well, let's just bump it to 20 playoff teams and see what happens. It'd be an easy fix.
Yeah, I think like the expansion thing's a great point. This league has never had less than half make the playoffs. In fact, you look at the ages, it was a 21 teams. Almost everyone got in.
Yeah.
So, and I know that they talked about the All-Star game, especially now with 4 nations, and well, the Islanders and their fans have been promised a All-Star, and they deserve this. And so as they're trying to kind of dance around, it was a great event. I don't know. I mean, if you want to compare it against an All-Star, you want to try and replicate that. I think that's a tough task. I don't know. I like that they're recognizing that it's not broken, that it definitely needs some amending, which is rare from Gary, because usually everything is good, as you say. But I am curious to see what they're going to try or how they're going to approach All-Star games / weekends moving forward.
Well, and it's a tough one to sell, right? Even though, again, the league would say it isn't. And it's not for the jaded hockey fan. It's for the local hockey fan and for the sponsors of the game locally and nationally. That's where they get their reward. And they get to see these players in an environment that isn't supercharged and intense and all of that. Well, again, the counter to that is, well, that's what makes the game special. And we just saw that at the 4 Nations, right? Where the players bought in, 100% bought in. But now that you have an international calendar that rolls every 2 years, is it imperative to have that All-Star weekend? Because you've got these other showcase events. And, the league will make do on its promise to the owners of the New York Islanders. They will get an event. We just don't know what that event is. And is it an on-ice event? I mean, it sounds a little goofy, but, all these great players are going to be funneling through the New York area on their way to the Olympics in Italy. Could you have some sort of fancy gala or some sort of media availability or something to justify just the New York Islanders are a historic franchise and this is a stop into the NHL getting back into the Olympic game? I don't know. I know that the league is going to do right by the New York Islanders, but I think the future of the NHL All-Star most definitely is in jeopardy, and right now is absolutely in question.
Can I make a suggestion? Because I've heard this talked about a bunch by people like yourself. The game's cooked. It's not going to happen. I still like the skills.
Yeah.
And you could easily make a Canada skills team, a USA skills team, a Europe skills team. And those are all the players we're going to be watching the following days
at
the Olympics. just leaning right into what we know is going to be a huge marquee event. Like to have the pros back at the Olympics for the first time since Sochi 12 years ago. Like, would you lean into that? I think that
it comes down to whether the players care, right?
The Stills, they always do, like, come rip it, right?
Yeah, they
I mean, Kucherov dogged it in Toronto, but I think it's a better shot than the game.
It's hard.
Yeah.
Especially when that's on the horizon so closely after.
And they're careful not to want to overtax the players, right? Like from that competitive aspect, because next season, if you look at the schedule next year, and it's going to be a challenging one. They have 14 fewer calendar days to work with. So you're going to get a number of back-to-backs, and I think there'll be stretches where teams are actually playing 5 games in 7 days. Like just nonsense. But what are you going to do? Given the matrix is starting, which they declared next season. I think the regular season opener is October 7th. So unless you're playing in September, which they have talked about, and staying on your calendar of then hoisting the cup in June, you're not adding more days. So it gets more of a challenge just trying to get rest for the players.
And to the point of is the league broken? It is not. You look around, it's going to be a fight to the finish in the Atlantic. You've got 3 teams there within a couple points of each other. Washington is stretched out, and it's going to be Carolina, New Jersey in the West. In the Pacific, Vegas, man, they looked good last night against Boston. They just exploded. I watched the tail end of that one. Edmonton and LA are in a fight. They're probably going to play each other, but who's at home? No Draisaitl to start the game last night. Stu Skinner leaves due to concussion protocol, and then David kind of gets tangled up with Josh Morrissey and leaves. It just feels like things aren't going the Oilers' way. This isn't the Calgary guy, but there's some hand wringing going on up north right now.
There is, as long as what we've seen of late, and the injuries that you talked about, including last night, are what they describe in their day-to-day, and they're nothing more than that, right? Because that's when you get into the dangerous territory, and we've already seen this. You get into the playoffs, especially when you go as deep as the Oilers went last year, and we know Leon Draisaitl for a good chunk of that playoff push wasn't healthy. He just wasn't. And when you think of top world-class players like that, you want to see them playing at their best. The issue that you have with the Oilers is there isn't a playoff spot that's being jeopardized here, but you can't really get into the mode of load management either, can you? Yeah. Unless you do it right now, because if Leon clearly is day-to-day and Connor McDavid all of a sudden is day-to-day, well, if day-to-day extends into 10 days, I think you have to be able and willing to live with that for the greater good, obviously, because if all of a sudden these guys come back after a couple of games and, with treatment, they slowly get better, and then you get an aggravation in game 80 of the regular season, well, you're no further ahead. So, yeah, I think that there's some cause for concern, but I didn't get the sense, and again, there's more evaluation and more testing that needs to get done from a medical perspective. But when I checked this morning, it didn't sound like there was anything that they were deeply worried about.
These wildcard races look like they're going to be really good. Like we had all counted the Islanders dead, especially after they trade Brock Nelson.
Yeah.
They're on a nice little heater, 2 points out. Habs have been a great story. Rangers still hanging around. And then out west, it seems like one spot for 4 teams. Utah got a win last night too, aside from all the talk about Calgary, Vancouver, and St. Louis.
Yeah, but how about St. Louis? I mean, there's just something about that team.
I was going to bring them up. Doug Armstrong does stuff, and we're like, what is Doug Armstrong seeing? These guys, what is he? Cam Fowler? Why are you making these kind of deals? And then you're trading guys. They're in it.
Well, they're in it. And so I'm going to tell you a quick story. And I don't know, we probably talked about this back in January when it went down. But Armstrong was so sour with how that team was playing that, he barged into the dressing room at one point and just read him the riot act. And literally, like, hey, I don't care what kind of trade protection you think you have. I'll find a way. Like, I am not going to tolerate this sort of play. So if you're not invested and you're not putting it on the line, then let me know and we'll figure something out. Like, that's and that sounds really heavy-handed. And when I found out about it at the time through a player agent, Doug didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want it out there, but I'm like, come on, man. Like, this is such a St. Louis way of doing things, you know. But you know, they've got top end guys that are in the back half of their career that just want to win, just flat out want to win. And I think of Jordan Bennington, I think of Braden Shen, go down the list, right? And they're okay with their name being top of mind in trade speculation leading up to the deadline. Do I think that Doug Armstrong was going to trade his captain? Now, not unless somebody would have really overpaid, but they were fine with the players being uncomfortable, because it almost kind of rejigged their focus and it intensified that focus into what they really have to drill down on. And so now, I mean, yeah, they're in a wild card spot in the West. Would I be surprised if they continue to move up? No, because they have the pieces. I don't think they have the horses to run with the better teams in either conference, but I think that they've got enough there to keep it interesting and make some noise. I do.
I was just looking. Kyrie's got 9 points in his last 4 games. Dylan Holloway's up to 23. I think he scored last night. Broberg gets the overtime winner.
From Holloway. Yep.
Yeah, it's not maybe not a masterclass, but Armstrong, he's obviously his fingerprints are all over because he's been there forever. But that was a huge not franchise changing, but it's part of the course of the direction they're on right now. That was massive, and I wonder if other teams are going to look at it and say, look. Yeah, for the cost of some picks and dollars, they're obviously better on the ice.
No question. And look, I just did a segment before I came on with Marty Biron and Brian Duff, Sabres Live in Buffalo, and they asked the same question. And I can tell you that there are lots of managers who would love to do what Doug Armstrong did. And every team in the National Hockey League has a list of the restricted free agents who they would circle as being worthy of that offer sheet consideration, and then a minute by minute cap profile on that team and projections on why this team is vulnerable. So of course teams are paying attention to it, but those cap spending teams are also teams that maybe learned that lesson that the Edmonton Oilers took right between the eyes. You can't put yourself in that situation. And if you do, then you've got to be willing to kind of give up on one, but not both. Like, they had to decide, okay, Dylan Holloway, we don't love the number that we're going to pay you right now, but we're going to pay you because the one thing that we can't give up on is more speed in this lineup. And that's what they did. In Broberg, I mean, that kid had asked for a trade, once, twice? Like, I don't know. I mean, he was in the American League, thought that he was an NHL defenseman, and he wasn't. And then he gets time later in the year, and in the playoffs, he looks pretty damn good. And everybody around Edmonton is like, "Ooh, geez, you know, it looks like they were right to make sure this guy was overseas." And then he's gone too, and they didn't do anything to replace those pieces. I mean, you could say Wallman now is a nice add, or will be to the Oilers' blue line, but Arvidsson and Skinner, the money invested there doesn't make sense to allowing the St. Louis Blues to come and pick your pocket on Holloway and Broberg. So everybody keeps waving the offer sheet threat. You know, is Bo Byram a top candidate? Hey, Matthew Nyes in Toronto was an RFA. I mean, go down the list. Yeah, but every GM that has those players says the same thing. Go ahead, try.
You know what? I think
we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
You know,
here in Calgary, we talk about it all the time. How do you get star players? Well, you got to finish in the bottom 5 and draft them. We know that the Flames and Craig Conroy were in to a certain extent on offer sheeting the 2 guys that went to St. Louis last year, and just it didn't go through with it. And I just wonder, between you need your own picks and they got those, and you need some cap space and some real money to spend, and they got all that too. I wonder if that is maybe one of those approaches that we here, as we talk about them every day, don't spend enough time focusing on. Maybe that's how you get your star or close to it, is by way of an offer sheet.
Well, I don't wonder. I know that that's what Calgary's looking at.
The other thing, though, we got to remember that you're alluding to, Dregs, is like.
Sorry, Ryan. Did you have something? Just wanted you to keep going there, Dregs.
No, Calgary's one of those teams for everything that you just said, Boomer. That makes sense. And it's not that Craig Conroy hasn't made trades. Of course, he's made trades. And he was one of the more persistent general managers in on Dylan Cousins with the Buffalo Sabres, and he ends up in Ottawa. Sometimes you don't have the playing capital or you don't want to break up your NHL roster, to try and get better in a different area. But you still want to navigate through the trade process and have meaningful trade negotiations, but you still come up empty-handed at certain times. And because Calgary has the pieces required, why wouldn't you? I don't doubt for a second that the Calgary Flames will be among the most aggressive in that area. I don't. I think that, but again, I'm repeating myself and saying, sure, everybody wants to pat Doug Armstrong on the back because he pulled off this great heist. And he did. Those are two high-quality young players. Terrific ads by the St. Louis Blues. But every Cap team is sitting there going, well, that ain't happening to me. We're not making the mistakes of Jeff Jackson and Stan Moman, and by extension, Kenny Holland-Maine. We're not doing that, but Calgary's going to try.
Yeah, and that's the point you're making, that like all the wanting to do it's great, but it was a rookie GM that walked himself into that trouble. He didn't keep an ARB case for a second buyout window. Yeah. He spent a ton of money July 1 on guys where he could have put it in a drawer like Lamoriello does, and that doesn't put him up against the cap. This was a huge blunder by a first-time GM that allowed St. Louis the opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many mulligans that could be taken and how they managed through that process in Edmonton. But hey, from our perspective, guys who have to fill airtime on shows like this, I hope that we're talking about this. I really, truly do. Because if I were a manager, I would try. Why wouldn't you? Hey, if you want to box yourself in as a team in the National Hockey League and you want to try and over-ripen one of your up-and-comers, well, that's on you. But the agents have a job, and that is to represent their clients to the best of their ability and make them the most money. And if the fit isn't right with the team that you're in for whatever reason, or they don't, the negotiation isn't going anyway. It gets a little greasy when all of a sudden, two guys end up at the same place, and you wonder how that could possibly be in such a short period of time. But I honestly, when you look at the restricted free agent class this year, there are lots of pieces, lots of players that we could envision the Calgary Flames and other teams circling and knowing would be great ads. Most of the teams would say, look, we'll match and we'll figure out a way to comply and get into the salary cap arena before puck drop. And that's what matters, right? So you can offer sheet, as long as you comply by game 1 of the regular season, then that's all that matters. So you can make tougher decisions before the season starts.
Okay, so I want to ask you both. If you want to get a player over, let's say 4.6 million was the cutoff last year, it probably comes a little higher. You got to use your own first. If each of you are the GM of the Calgary Flames, are you comfortable putting your first round pick on the table to chase someone like a Byram, like a Nyes, which other RFA is the apple of your eye, knowing you might just be a Dustin Wolf injury away from that being like a top 5 pick and a superstar, or a lottery win that turns into McKenna? Like, would you do it or not? Because that's the real tough one I think Connie's going to face, is that
I'll start.
Pluck some middle guys, but to get someone over 5, that's first.
Mm-hmm. I'll do it because you also have to look at your Nazem Kadris and your Jonathan Hubertos, who are playing pretty well, right? And the window, even though it's not wide open, is somewhat open. And you're trying to transition on the fly when you're doing that. But if you're waiting for that first round top 5, top 6, top 10, top 15 pick to materialize, best case scenario, you're 3 to 5 years down the road, and you're in it in a different cycle. And it also depends on the player we're talking about. I would like Matthew Nyes isn't going to happen because Toronto would match. They just wouldn't allow themselves to be threatened in that world. And the Bo Byram situation is also unique because I'm not sure Bo Byram wants to extend in Buffalo. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's been so much stuff there. So if his message is I'm not extending, then maybe Kevin Adams at the draft here just figures out, well, I'm not going to take the risk, and he moves him out anyway. But if it was as simple as giving up a first-round pick and you got Matthew Nyes back,
yeah,
every day of the week,
year. Like he's probably going to
every
get
day
30,
of the week,
and he's like 220 pounds. Like he's a beast.
That's what that was going to be my answer. Is I would do it for Nyes.
Yeah,
because on the flip side, I agree. I think I might be able to make some kind of a trade for Byram. I might be able to get him. They're never trading Nyes.
No.
So if I can force their hand, and
Carolina tried for Mikko Rantanen, and Toronto just they had conversation about Marner, even though he had the no move, as we know, but they wouldn't even consider Nyes, not even remotely.
And I guess just before we go, we talked about him the other day because I'm sure you saw Toronto dismantle the Flames before they went in and dismantled the Rangers. I just went and looked at the Rangers, and I don't see a lot of UFAs. They're locked into that. This can be a long summer if they miss the Islanders making it before the Rangers. Who would have thought if that in fact happens?
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I also wonder about knowing how volatile the ownership is of the New York Rangers. And both those teams, the Islanders and the Rangers, could see change. I just saw Lou Lamoriello at the GM meetings, man. He looks as healthy as a horse. Like he hasn't aged a day in 30 years. Like it's remarkable, but here's a guy that at some point is going to go, okay, well, I've been an NHL general manager and executive for several decades. It's probably time to get out of the way. And I don't know that that's imminently happening this season. But if it did, would the look of the Islanders change, in the eye of Patrick Roy and the players that he sees and wants to come in? With the New York Rangers, undoubtedly there will be additional changes. And Chris Drury, I mean, he has been aggressive this year. A lot of it through necessity, but this whole season has been a year of upheaval. You go back to the Jake Trouba situation, Chris Kreider finding out he's on the trade block, like just all kinds of nasty stuff that kind of put the New York Rangers in the toilet early on. So when I think of change in New York, I mean, maybe it's front office change. Maybe it is the general manager. Maybe it's Peter Laviolette, another coach off the bench in New York. Then I look at the roster and I wonder about Zibanejad. I happen to like Lafreniere, but there's always kind of low level, mutterings around him, and then on and on and on it goes. So two pretty big clubs that might look a lot different next year.
All right, buddy. Is it bourbon and honey? Is that what you do for a?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Peter Marr used to. It was like a weird vinegar cocktail. It was
vinegar, yeah.
Yeah. Was it like red cider or just white vinegar?
I never saw it. He just said he would take vinegar and gargle it, or
oil too. He always
a few sips, and then he'd be good to go.
I did the 2000. We got to wrap up here, but I did the 05 Men's World Championship. I was the analyst with Peter, and I mean, I was starstruck in there, and obviously it was Canada. Ginla playing, and 2 or 3 times he would say, Ginla comes out of the Canadian zone, and I'm like, and then he'd say Calgary because he kind of get lost every once in a while.
Yeah, oh yeah,
I loved every second, but ever then, in the commercial break, he'd take a sip of something, and I'm like, what is he like? Swilling on vodka here? What's going on?
It could be.
It's a phlegm cutter. That's what that is.
That's right. Yeah, good stuff. Take care of yourself, bud. We'll talk to you next week.
You bet. Take care.
There you go. Darren Dreger, TSN Hockey Insider, our insider here on the hotline, a presentation of Crystal Waters Plumbing and Heating, your crystal clear choice. 403-219-4100, or check them out, crystalclearcalgary.com.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. Be sure to check out more of our content right here on the Flames Nation YouTube page. We had a bunch of great long form interviews. You can check out some videos we've done as well outside of the studio. And of course, if you want more writing or merchandise stuff, flamesnation.ca or nationgear.ca. Appreciate you watching.